So today we will look at some color matching and how to fix edges in Photoshop for wildlife and more specifically for birds. I will start with one of the very first techniques I used to make fun composites of wildlife, actually birds. I had plenty of BIFs, that is birds in flight, and after a while the plain blue sky as the background in all of them was really getting boring. While the subject changed, the background remained the same over and over and over again. This remains the same even today. For example, these are my April shots during the lockdown. But if I go to my all photos selection and just search for BIF and I go back to the start, not too sure why this is in BIF, but just look at it. Excepting for some, mostly it is blue, some that I have changed the background, for example this, it's mostly blue. Different birds, different subjects, but the background remains blue. So it can get pretty monotonous and boring after a while. I was very happy at times when I actually saw some clouds or maybe some other kind of background that I got the bird against. Not obviously such a busy background like this one, or even this for that matter. So good shots, good subjects, but not really appealing because of the very plain blue background. And if you have these kind of shots in a photo stream, like for example on Flickr or 500px or Viewbug or even on Facebook in an album, it really gets boring to look at the blue and the blue, even for people who love the color. So let's see how I got around that issue and also how we can fix and match the background colors. So I've selected a few of these shots, although I have another 3 here, but we'll start with this. And instead of loading these files one by one into Photoshop, I will simply select all of these, right click on the selected ones, go into edit and open as layers in Photoshop, a process that I will speed up in the recording. So we don't have to reload the background layers every time. So it will start sometime now. Okay, so all the images are now loaded into layers in Photoshop. And as we can see, these are different crops, so the sizes vary. We'll just turn off the others for now, the backgrounds that we've chosen, and we'll get them into the picture one by one. For now, we just zoom into our current subject. And in this case, instead of going into select and trying the subject area or the focus area first, I will do a select color range in this case because all of the blues are easier to select, and for example you can actually select it out from here, but you see the color also going, so just select it here. The fuzziness determines basically how much of the blues in the blue range are to be matched. For example, if I push this up, you can see the feathers also being selected. And now if I pull it back, you can see that part is gone. If I press a shift, click on this part, this is also selected. If I press a shift and click on this part, this is also selected. So we seem to have a reasonable selection. We don't mind the branches, those can be brushed off. And let's just do a OK on this and create a layer mask. Oops, that should have been inverted. Create a layer mask. We'll just switch to the brush tool B, make sure black is selected, increase the brush size, and maybe right click and check for the hardness. We just set it to 100. I just want to wipe this off, and I do see some blues here. Yes, so we can use the brush, make it small, right click, change the hardness to around 80-85, zoom in a bit more by pressing the Z and clicking, so the tool will not get deselected. We don't really have to do this. We'll try different methods of fixing the edges later. So we have a subject. We choose the move tool. The V key is the shortcut for this, and let's move it to the center someplace. And now let's select the first background. As you can see, the moment I select this, you'll still have to go into the brush because we have a line there. Make sure the black is selected and just clean up the line. This will happen at times when the sizes don't match. The subject is smaller. Okay, so now the blues are more visible. So let's try another. You can still see the blues, and you can still see the blues. So one way out is we go into color range again. Make sure invert is on. And carefully select just this blue. Make sure you are on the layer mask, otherwise this won't work. So now the blues have reduced, the rest we will deal with. The most common way of dealing with the edges is select and mask. This radius will determine how much Photoshop will look for at the edges in terms of pixels. When you try and refine the edges, the smart radius controls this value that we've already set as the radius as to how much inside and outside the edge that you've marked will be impacted. Now if we pick up the refine edge tool and zoom in, R for refine edge, we just make this a bit smaller, and once you try and refine an edge here using this refine edge, this is where the smart radius comes in, how much it will look for inside and outside the actual edge. And sometimes the sample all layers can be useful, which I'll come to later. As you can see, it's a huge difference here. For now we'll just undo that, and smoothing is essentially the edges which will be slightly smoothed off. Somewhere around a small value. The feathering will decide as to how much of the edge can be removed or restructured. And if we shift the edge back a bit, decontaminate colors will generally not work for most of these images, but in some cases it can work wonders. So we'll cancel out of this. The next method is, while keeping the layer mask selected, is to go into filter, other, and a minimum filter. What this will do is, it's already done that, it'll go around the selection and you can set the number of pixels it will reduce. So around that should be good enough. We can do an OK there. The third option is, we can actually use the smudge tool, which is along with the blur and sharpen. You pick up the smudge tool and just smudge the edges in, just like that, wherever you need to. You can also use it to smooth out edges rather. So that also allows us to clean up a lot. Now, for example, let's say this particular background, although it is appealing, but maybe not very realistic. So what we can do is go into blur gallery, a field blur, and pull up the blur to a huge amount, maybe the maximum. Or maybe somewhere around there. So you get the idea. You can pick up any kind of photo and use that as a background. For example, let's say this. And this we will also use to demonstrate how to match colors. Now obviously it does not really match temperature and color wise. One way would be to try and match the white balances. Another way is, I would generally keep the subject and prefer to modify the background. So we can add an adjustment layer of curves, clip it just to this because we have plenty of other backgrounds. You can either go into the menu and auto options, or alt, that is option, and click on auto. Now we find the dark and light colors here. This is the shadows, this is the highlights. So that's how we're going to work with it. But before we get into that, when we created the curves layer, it is selected the mask. Make sure the curves is selected before option clicking the auto. We can remove this for now. Shadows, we'll try and pick the darkest part of the subject, and for highlights we'll try and pick the brightest part. That's about it. No, we don't need to save. And as you can see, it's a lot better. You can obviously play around with the individual colors and try different points for the blacks and whites. Don't worry about this. This is not really there. The banding does not really exist. It's just that we are unable to resolve those details. So what about, let's say, a moon? Let's zoom in. Maybe press the V to move the moon around a bit. We can also press Command T for transform and increase the size of the moon. And of course distort it, just to make sure that we can see it's being changed. So in this case we do the same. We add a curves adjustment, clip it to just that layer, make sure the curves are selected, option, click on auto, make sure it's find dark and light colors. The shadows, we'll choose the same area of the subject. For the highlights, again more or less the same area. As you can see, the background is now far more conformant to the overall subject. Now, why we started with the select color? Now if we go back here and just cancel out and zoom into this part, we go back into color range and just select this blue. Now one of the advantages of selecting using a color range, especially with the consistent blue background and whatever you might have, maybe total cloudy white, that you can actually increase the fuzziness of the selection and have some of the background colors creeping through the subject. So now that I've increased the fuzziness, we'll have some of the moon color and background seeping through. Now some of these points are visible. You can either take the brush and clean it up or use the smudge tool to smudge them in, just like that, gently, and it merges perfectly with the background. So that's how to match colors and choose different backgrounds and totally transform even a simple cloud background, or rather cloudy background, is capable of totally transforming an image which has a plain simple blue. So we have this, we have another one. Now wherever you have these kind of backgrounds, or even the web that we just saw, standard operating procedure is going to blur gallery, a field blur, and push up the blur to a level where you don't really see much of the original, where you can ID what it was. And generally your background shots would be more or less full frame compared to a subject which generally would be cropped. Rarely you will get a full frame bird or any wildlife in a full frame, excepting maybe for macros, insects. So once you are done with this blur part, choose the move tool, the shortcut being V. Move the background around to see where it actually looks best with the edges of the existing subject. Now because we increase the fuzziness in the blue selection, you can see the colors seeping through from the background. As we move the background, the colors coming through the feathers also change. So that's about it. Defeat the blues.